Well, welcome everyone, and apologies for the technical difficulties as we get started tonight. My name's Leanne Smith and I'm the Director of the Whitlam Institute. We had hoped to be joined this evening by Uncle Greg Sims, who is one of the Western Sydney University elders on campus, but unfortunately he's taken ill, so he won't be able to join us tonight. In which case it falls to me to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the land of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and a special welcome to any First Nations people who are here with us this evening. Welcome and thank you to our distinguished speakers who will be speaking after Tim tonight and who I'll introduce to you shortly. But also a special welcome to our guests, Kate Jenkins, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Alistair McEwen, the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, the member for Werriwa, Anne Stanley MP, the member for Macquarie Fields, Annaluk Chanthavang MP, the Honourable Jeff Gallop, I think is here with us tonight, former Premier of Western Australia and the Director of the Graduate School of Government at Sydney University, the Vice-Chancellor of our university, Barney Glover, Whitlam Institute Chairman, the Honourable John Faulkner, and Board Member Catherine Dovey, and to one of the Institute's longest-standing supporters, Susie Carlton. Thank you for coming tonight. And to all of you for coming to join us this evening to hear Dr. Tim Soutphommasane deliver his final speech as Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner. I wanted to say at the outset a bit about how the evening will run. So following Tim's speech, we'll invite our panellists, Dr. John Hewson, AM, and the Honourable Mark Dreyfus, QC MP, to make some comments in response to Tim's speech. And then Tim, John and Mark would be very glad to engage with you in a dialogue question and answer session. We should finish by about 8:30 and then we'll invite you to join us for some refreshments afterwards. The Whitlam Institute, where we're gathered this evening, exists for all Australians. We are striving to build a nationally significant institution working across the political spectrum to deliver distinctive, bold and inspiring policy research and programs that promote common ground, inclusive national identity and civic engagement for all Australians. We're committed to the objective that Gough himself set for us, which was to help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. Now, every Australian who's not one of our First Peoples has their own migrant story, whether hundreds of years old or very new. My own grandparents migrated from Malta after the Second World War. Paul and Pauline were white, European and English-speaking migrants to this lucky country. They loved Australia and all of the opportunities it afforded them and their children and their grandchildren. And yet, as a child, I remember rare occasions when I would hear part of the darker side of their migrant experience. Being refused accommodation at boarding houses when they first arrived in Sydney. Working under harsh, exploitative and degrading conditions. Being spat at for fishing for and eating mussels from Sydney Harbour at a time before ordinary Australians thought that mussels were worthy food or good eating. What a change, yes indeed. It still makes my nana cry when we go out and pay for seafood like that. As a grandchild, learning that my grandparents decided not to teach my mother and her brothers their mother tongue in order that they wouldn't stand out or perceived to be different, and so they would fit in. And sadly, I also have to say, as I got older, listening to them, my grandparents, listening to Alan Jones blaring from the kitchen radio, learning how to be real Australians and also learning how to differentiate themselves from later generations of migrants coming from other parts of the world. And so it goes. Now, I know that Australia has changed much since the time my grandparents migrated and that our country has been incredibly enriched by the multiculturalism and the tolerance we enjoy today. I am grateful to be able to celebrate my culture and heritage and to learn from those of my friends and my colleagues. But history shows that we can never take these things for granted. And that's why I am personally so honoured to have Tim make his final speech here tonight. Dr. Tim Soutphommasane has served as Australia's Racial Discrimination Commissioner since August 2013, and his 5-year term ends later this month. Prior to joining the Human Rights Commission, he was a political philosopher and held posts at the University of Sydney and Monash University. A first-generation Australian, Dr. Soutphommasane was raised in southwest Sydney. He completed his Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. And among his many publications, Tim found time to write one for us at the Whitlam Institute in 2016 on the Whitlam Government and the Racial Discrimination Act. The former director of the Whitlam Institute, Eric Sidoti, said of that paper, "It provokes a contemporary consideration of the role that legislation can play, both in catalysing and in embedding social change. It reminds us that fundamental matters of human relations, in this case race and culture, the social questions are never settled with any finality. It points to the consequential need for vigilance, intellectual honesty, and the determination to stay the course." So I will now hand over to Tim to deliver his final speech as Race Discrimination Commissioner. But before I do, I just wanted to share with you some footage of Australia's 21st Prime Minister speaking with our own John Faulkner about the import of the Racial Discrimination Act, particularly for Australia's First Peoples, as well as its newest arrivals. So my colleague Lyndall is going to help me just set this up quickly.
Australia's oldest inhabitants and newest arrivals benefited from the Whitlam Government's reforms. Immigration laws were liberalised and migrant communities embraced Whitlam. The government passed the landmark Racial Discrimination Act.
On the basis of that, all the improvements which have been made in human rights in Australia, they're founded on that. Because racial discrimination was partly to cure the disabilities that migrants had, but also, of course, to cure the disabilities that Aborigines had, because the original Constitution had referred to people of the Aboriginal race. Therefore, the High Court could scarcely say that the Racial Discrimination Convention didn't cover Aborigines, because the Constitution referred to them as a race. And what we've achieved in the terms of ending discrimination has been brought about to the extent that the federal government has ratified these international conventions and has made them parts of Australian law. Because once you ratify a convention, then you're bound by world best practice. Once you enact it, you carry out world's best practice. And the great advantage of doing these international conventions is they've all been drawn up, they've all been approved by bodies to which all our neighbours belong. That is, we'll feel secure, in Keating's great phrase, secure in our neighbourhood instead of just feeling secure against our neighbourhood.
Well, good evening and thank you very much, Leanne. And can everyone hear me in the back? Wonderful. How wonderful it is to follow Gough Whitlam. Can I begin by acknowledging the Darug people as the traditional owners of the land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Also would like to acknowledge Barney Glover, Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University, to members of the board of the Whitlam Institute, Chair John Faulkner and Catherine Dovey, to Mark Dreyfus and John Hewson. Looking forward to our panel later this evening. Also Anne Stanley MP, Analak Jantibong MP, Dr. Jeff Gallup, and my colleagues Kate Jenkins and Alistair McEwen, distinguished guests. What an honour it is to join you this evening. I can think of no more fitting place to give what is my final speech as Race Discrimination Commissioner. Because as I reflect on the state of our race relations and our society's efforts to combat racism, it's clear that so much of it bears the imprint of the Whitlam government. It is equally clear that much of the future story of Australian multiculturalism and racial equality will be written here in Western Sydney. I join you as a proud son of Western Sydney. When my family moved here from France in 1985, it was in the southwest suburbs of Sydney where we settled. My childhood was spent growing up in Canley Vale and Bonnyrigg Heights. I went to school in Canley Vale and Glenfield. And the Western Sydney I grew up in was the land of Whitlam. I studied at the E.G. Whitlam Library in Cabramatta. My local swimming pool was at the Whitlam Leisure Centre in Liverpool. My junior Mount Pritchard cricket team played at Whitlam Park in Heckenberg. In a part of Sydney that was and remains the heartland of multicultural Australia, it was only appropriate that the children of migrants would grow up familiar with the Prime Minister whose government laid the foundations of our racial equality. The 1980s were an interesting time for a family from an Asian background to have arrived in this country. That decade saw the first challenges to Australia's official multiculturalism and non-discriminatory immigration policy. A national debate about Asian immigration had erupted. Prominent historian Geoffrey Blaney warned that migrants were conducting a colonisation of this country, one that would result in us fracturing into a nation of tribes. Following Blaney, then opposition leader John Howard argued that the levels of Asian immigration could not be absorbed by Australian society. And then came the 1990s. Pauline Hanson was elected to the federal parliament as the member for Oxley. Her message: Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians. In Hanson's words, these were people who have their own culture and religion, form ghettos, and do not assimilate. I recall my family speaking about those debates. These were debates that cut to our very core. As migrants, my family and I came to this country with a desire to be part of Australia, not to colonise it. Within 3 years of arriving here, we had all naturalised as citizens. We were proud to be Australians. But clearly there were times when we were made to feel we may not belong, when we were told by some that they would never accept us as truly Australian. Our society got through those debates of the 1980s and 90s. 20 years ago, in 1988, the Asian immigration debate was resolved when the Commonwealth Parliament affirmed Australia's commitment to a racially non-discriminatory immigration program, with a number of Liberal parliamentarians crossing the floor to support that motion. As for Hansonism, the threat it posed seemed to fade away when Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party famously imploded. Australia today has good reason to boast that it is one of the most successful multicultural societies in the world. And yet, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Our public discourse rehearses many of those concerns that we seem to have dealt with 2 and 3 decades ago. We are again grappling with questions of race, immigration, and multiculturalism. Tonight, I'd like to reflect on these public debates and the resurgent threats posed by racism. I believe the story of our multiculturalism is one of success. But while we can be proud of this, the success is not yet complete. As citizens, we have every reason right now to be vigilant. And we must remain vigilant because race politics is back. I take no pleasure in saying this, and it causes me pain to say this, but it feels right now that there's never been a more exciting time to be a dog-whistling politician or race-baiting commentator in Australia. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have said it was likely that we would see the resurgence of far-right politics. I wouldn't have expected that the biggest threats to racial harmony would come from within our parliaments and from sections of the media. Yet here we are. In one sense, race and racism have never gone away. This is the paradox of our multiculturalism. For all that we've been transformed into a diverse and vibrant nation, racism remains alive in our society, and not only as a vestige of an old bigotry and chauvinism. Maybe it's too much, after all, to expect that racism could ever be purged. Prejudice and discrimination are like the permanent stains of our humanity, inconvenient reminders of our incurable imperfection. Here are the facts, though, on what racism looks like in Australia today. According to the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion survey in 2017, about 20% of people have experienced discrimination during the past 12 months. We know that those from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds experience racism at much higher levels. Reconciliation Australia's Barometer survey of 2016 found that 46% of Indigenous people experienced racism during the past 6 months. Moreover, Indigenous people encounter institutional racism in a way very different to other groups in our society. Many would describe this as the legacy of colonial racism. And we know too that those from non-English speaking backgrounds experience racial or religious discrimination at higher rates as well. The Scanlon Foundation highlights that 77% of people from African backgrounds say they've experienced discrimination in the past 12 months. About 34% of those from a non-English speaking background say they've also experienced discrimination. That racism continues with such prevalence should be enough to cause us concern. But more concerning is the mixing of race and politics. It is clear that politicians right now are enthusiastically seeking debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and race. This is dangerous territory for us. When politicians resort to using race to advance their agendas, they will inevitably excite racial anxiety and they will stir up social division. They will end up damaging our racial tolerance and our multicultural harmony. And just as there was in the 1980s and 90s, there is now panic setting in about migrants and minorities. Let's consider the evidence here. Since the start of this year, media and political concern about a so-called African gangs crisis in Melbourne has grown feverish. According to some, Melburnians are now afraid to go out for dinner because of rampant African youth crime. Last month, the Prime Minister declared there was real concern about Sudanese gangs. The Liberal state opposition in Victoria has distributed pamphlets claiming it would stop gangs hunting in packs. Pamphlets that featured a shadowy photograph of hooded, dark-skinned youths. There's a return, too, of old debates about multiculturalism. In a speech last month in London, the Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, Alan Tudge, warned that Australia was veering towards a European separatist multicultural model. Other ministers have spoken about a growing phenomenon of ghettoisation in our suburbs. Against this background of concerns, the government has indicated it will seek to introduce new English language requirements for permanent residency and citizenship, and possibly also a new values test for those seeking permanent residency. And as we know, immigration is indeed back as a subject for political contest. And it's not just about the number of migrants, it's also what kind of migrants we're taking in. Earlier this year, Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton proposed that white South African farmers should receive special attention for fast-tracked humanitarian visas because of their alleged persecution. Last month, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott questioned whether we should accept any migrants at all from Africa, suggesting they are difficult to integrate. And just last week, News Corp columnist Andrew Bolt argued that we are seeing a tidal wave of immigration overwhelming Australia, that Jews, Indians, and Chinese were forming ethnic colonies across the country. Clearly, we are seeing a challenge to the non-discriminatory immigration policy that Australia has had since the end of the White Australia policy. The spectre of history never lurks far from our public debates, of course. Just consider very briefly as well the debate about foreign influence. Notable commentators have suggested there's a silent invasion of Australia being conducted by China, with the Chinese party state planting fifth column operatives within our public institutions. Now, don't get me wrong, it goes without saying that we've got to defend our democratic institutions from foreign interference. But this should give us no excuse to rerun old fears about the yellow peril. Making things worse, some are now charging anyone who dares raise concerns about racism as pushing a weaponized narrative about Australian racism that has been ordered by Beijing. Public debates help to set the tone for our society. What happens in our politics shapes what we experience in our daily lives. At the moment, because of our public debates, there are some groups in our society who stand more vulnerable than ever to racism. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from a woman here in Sydney who got racially abused in a local cafe. Another customer came around to her and told her to go back to China, declaring that all Chinese are communists. Last month, while holding a stall in Redfern, Jenny Leong, a Greens MP in the New South Wales Parliament, was harangued by a woman who said to her, "I know your plan. We are now all second-class citizens because you Chinese are taking over." These are some of the effects of debates about a silent invasion by the Chinese Communist Party. We shouldn't be surprised that some people may vent racial hostility at people of Chinese backgrounds if they're being told that there is a threat from Communist China. There's the more insidious impact, the powerful chilling effect that debates can have on Chinese Australian citizens. Many fear speaking out in public debates now, lest they get smeared as being agents of foreign influence. If we're not more careful, we may end up demanding that Chinese Australians work many times harder than others to demonstrate their loyalty to this country. We may end up, in other words, with what may only be described as a form of racial discrimination justified as concern about national sovereignty. Let's consider as well the effects of the talk about African gangs. Now, I know there's much hurt and dismay being felt right now by African Australians, in particular Sudanese Australians. Some Sudanese Australian leaders have spoken out about how their community is living with a sense of shame and a sense of rejection. In one recent article in The Guardian Australia, Father Daniel Guy Alou, an Anglican minister in Sunshine in Melbourne's West, said, and I quote, "I can say I'm an Australian, but my colour only betrays me." Pastor Nathan Kuku, who leads a congregation in nearby Albion, said, and I quote, "We feel like we don't have any backup in this country." Well, I guess it would feel that way when you have even the Prime Minister singling out your community. So the consequences are all too real. Within Sudanese Australian communities, there are many people who are fearful about leaving their homes now, who are sheltering from society. And this affects Australians who have other African backgrounds too. Young African Australians in Melbourne have told me of occasions when they've walked to sporting events as a group, only to be stopped in the street because members of the public have called police, fearing they were marauding gang members. This happens. Such experiences aren't new or even unique. The kind of racial profiling I've described exists for other groups in our society. In my work, I've heard regularly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about experiences of being stopped in stores or subjected to searches or being denied service by businesses or by taxis. Australians from Arab and Middle Eastern backgrounds, those from Asian backgrounds, they too have had to contend with the sting of racial stereotyping. In the time when I was growing up as a teenager, for example, I know that talk about Asian gangs and so-called Asian ghettos in the suburbs made many young Asian Australians feel disgraced and humiliated. It made many question their very place in this country. And this is how racism works. It creates doubts and divisions, and it drives its targets into retreat. Where the seeds of racism are planted in political speech, they will bear bitter fruit in society. It's not just politics, by the way, that's behind this. Alongside the politicisation of racial fear, we're also seeing the monetisation of racism. Sections of a fracturing media industry, under the strain of technological change, seem to be using racism as part of their business model. Faced with competition from a proliferation of news and entertainment sources, some media outlets are using racial controversies to grab attention as a means of clinging on to their shrinking audiences. You see this, for example, in the way that some media outlets regularly fawn upon far-right political commentators from North America. These avatars of white nationalism are typically lauded as alt-right showmen or alt-right provocateurs. They're given sympathetic platforms to spread messages of hate and division. With this kind of license, you can't be surprised to find far-right groups being emboldened like never before. And it's got to the point now where commentators on national television can tell people to go back to where they came from on air and not experience any kind of sanction from their network. Commentators can entertain fantasies about running over Muslim riders with barely a slap on the wrist. Commentators with histories of inciting racism and of running foul of laws against racial discrimination have the audacity to label anti-racism speech or anti-racist speech as forms of race baiting. Just last night, we had Sky News, through host Adam Giles, the former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, give a platform to an avowed neo-Nazi and convicted violent criminal, Blair Cottrell. This is the same Blair Cottrell who has called for every classroom in Australia to be adorned with a portrait of Adolf Hitler. The same Blair Cottrell who has been convicted of arson, stalking, and aggravated burglary. The same Blair Cottrell who has been convicted of breaking the Victorian Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. Even for Sky News, this was a shameful low. But perhaps this is where things are heading. Why bother with importing racist commentators when you can just put a neo-Nazi thug on air? Well, we need to restore some standards in our public debates. We need to restore some proportion and perspective. Take multiculturalism. There is simply no evidence that Australian multiculturalism is in danger of veering towards ethnic separatism. The evidence shows that we continue to conduct integration extremely well. The children of migrants, on average, outperform the children of Australian-born parents on education and employment. Just only need to look here on this campus to see evidence of that. Our social mobility remains high by international standards. These areas which people like to slander as ethnic ghettos, they're dynamic and vibrant communities where no single ethnic or racial group predominates and where property prices have been on a steady rise. Hardly signs of ethnic ghettos. On the so-called Sudanese crime crisis in Melbourne, if we turn to the facts, it's true to say that Sudanese Australian people are overrepresented in crime statistics. That's true. But they're not the only group that's overrepresented in crime statistics. It's also the case that Australian-born and New Zealand-born offenders are overrepresented in crime statistics. But if that's the case, why all the attention on crimes committed by those from Sudanese backgrounds? If we're to focus, for example, on the ethnicity or race of offenders, why wasn't there an uproar about the backgrounds of those who caused a violent brawl at a recent AFL match in Geelong? Where was the focus on the racial backgrounds of all those who've committed in recent years cowardly one-punch attacks? Where was the commentary about the ethnic or racial background of notorious murderers such as Adrian Bailey or Roger Rogerson or Carl Williams? Why is there one standard around ethnicity and crime being applied to some groups but not being applied to others? I know that some of you will say today a sense of proportion is going to be elusive for us, given we are living in what seems to be a post-truth world. You do get the feeling sometimes it's a case of choose your own reality now. But there's got to be no relativism whatsoever when it concerns racism. We must hold the line and we must maintain our standards. It's the Racial Discrimination Act that sets our standards. It's done so for more than 4 decades. The Act will turn out to be the final legislative act of the Whitlam Government, coming into effect on the 31st of October 1975, a week or so before the dismissal. When the Act was introduced, Whitlam described it as a historic measure, symbolic of his government's philosophy. It was, of course, during the years of the Whitlam Government that the last remnants of the White Australia policy were abolished. The idea of multiculturalism emerged as official government policy, with Al Grasby's advocacy for an enlarged family of the nation. And while Whitlam recognised the difficulty of legislating for social change, he nonetheless made clear that the new Act would serve to set standards for the future and build a climate of maturity, of goodwill, of cooperation and understanding at all levels of society. The idea of a Racial Discrimination Act was not universally welcomed at that time. The second reading speeches on the Racial Discrimination Bill of 1975 saw extended debate about the wisdom of outlawing racial discrimination. Queensland National Senator Glenn Shiel argued that the bill would have the most dangerous effect of creating an official race relations industry with a staff of dedicated anti-racists who would be intent on persecuting white Australians. Another Queenslander, Liberal Senator Ian Wood, argued, quote, "It is a lot of utter nonsense and rubbish to bring such a bill before this Parliament, since racialism in this country probably is practiced less than it is in the big majority of countries." Shadow Attorney General Ivor Greenwood declared, and I quote, "We in Australia have been singularly free of racial discrimination." And he warned that there would be, and I quote, "a tendency for laws of this kind to be used as a source of provocation, a focal point for professional agitators who wanted to stir trouble." The denial of racism's existence, the charge that anti-racism stirs up division, these have not gone away. These strains are still with us, sadly, more than 40 years on from those debates. The reactionary ghosts of Shiel, Wood, and Greenwood still haunt, for example, our parliamentary chambers. It was only a few months ago that Liberal National Senator Ian MacDonald would echo his Queensland predecessors in declaring it very difficult to find any but very rare cases of racism in Australia. Others, such as Attorney General Christian Porter, have indicated a clear discomfort with efforts against racial discrimination, instead preferring a focus on the happier concern of harmony. Fortunately, such views haven't prevailed. Back in 1975, the Racial Discrimination Bill passed, with notable support from opposition senators including Fred Chaney and Neville Bonner. The Liberal coalition government and Malcolm Fraser never moved to repeal the new Racial Discrimination Act. Its steadfast approach to resettling refugees from Southeast Asia spoke volumes about the leadership it was prepared to exercise on race. There were perhaps some early lessons from all this about how the Racial Discrimination Act could only work with some measure of bipartisan support. Indeed, on issues of race, we've only been able to achieve progress when there's recognition of what is at stake: the harmony, the stability, the justness of Australian society, and an understanding that these are things which are too important to be relegated to a matter of partisan contest. Yes, there may always be some philosophical differences about the nuances about what racial equality must mean, but the basic principle has got to remain the same. The law sets a standard, and it's only right that it sets a standard. And for most of the 43 years of the Racial Discrimination Act's existence, the Act has done its job. It has been, in effect, the legislative expression of Australian multiculturalism. It's given all Australians, of whatever background, a means of holding racial discrimination to account. And while it's not perfect, it has proven to be a powerful instrument of justice. It's become an important part of our human rights architecture. As demonstrated by the Mabo case, the Act underpinned the development of native title. Earlier this year, the Act helped deliver to the people of Palm Island in Queensland a landmark settlement with the Queensland State Government, including an apology for systemic racial discrimination and a payment of $30 million. Let it never be said that the Racial Discrimination Act is a toothless tiger. That, of course, seems to be a point that opponents and critics of the Act know only too well. Were the legislation so completely impotent and ineffectual, it would not have been such a target of ideological politics in recent years. These past 5 years, as you know, we've seen heated contest about Section 18C of the Act, which makes it unlawful to do an act which offends, insults, humiliates, or intimidates someone because of their race. On 2 occasions, in 2014 and in 2017, the federal government, under both Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, moved to amend the Act. They were cheered on by prominent sections of the media and by the Institute of Public Affairs. And on both occasions, the push failed. The Abbott government in August 2014 abandoned its attempt to repeal 18C after a widespread backlash to then Attorney General George Brandis's suggestion that people have a right to be bigots. The Turnbull government in 2016 moved to have a parliamentary committee inquire into free speech and the RDA. In March 2017, a government bill to amend 18C was introduced in the Senate, and there it was defeated on the floor of the Senate. Let's reflect on these debates. We've seen through these debates an outpouring of support for the Racial Discrimination Act. First Australians, ethnic communities, civil society advocates, all have been united in defending the Act. Labor and Greens have been unwavering in their stance too. And while the government's policy has been to change the Act, we've seen a number of Liberal parliamentarians express vocal and important support for keeping the Act as it is. Again, you might say, we've seen how the endurance of the Act depends on some measure of bipartisan support. But while they've brought out support for racial equality, the debates about 18C have been difficult ones for people who experience racism. They've opened the door to prejudice, intolerance, and even hatred. When I took on my role in 2013, I never imagined that the Attorney General of Australia would, on the Senate floor, defend a right to bigotry. I certainly never imagined that the cause of free speech would become defined by a desire to inflict racial vilification onto others. I also didn't anticipate that I would end up being caught up in a central way in the second political attack on 18C in 2016-17. Some have argued that in my role as Commissioner, I've improperly touted for or solicited complaints under the Racial Discrimination Act against the late cartoonist Bill Leak. That's simply not true. I did make clear that people who are racially offended about material could lodge a complaint. But it's part of my role as Commissioner to promote public understanding and acceptance of the Act. This includes informing people about the option they have to make a complaint under the law if they've experienced racial hatred. I mean, it'd be a very odd situation if the Race Discrimination Commissioner were to be unable to speak about the Racial Discrimination Act. But as I've said, the debates have been intense. It's because the push to change 18C has been driven by ideological passions and by a certain form of identity politics. Those who rail against 18C tend to see things in a certain way. The RDA is regarded as an example of political correctness gone mad and of multicultural identity politics born of cultural Marxism. The critics of 18C believe that public debates have supposedly been stifled because people fear that speaking frankly would lead them to be branded as racist by progressives intent on virtue signalling. They believe that certain racial and ethnic minorities are afforded greater protections under anti-discrimination law than members of mainstream Australia. They believe that the real racism today is something they call reverse racism. Let's for a moment consider this idea that political correctness has shut down debates about race. It's hard to see how debates about race have been shut down when the Australian newspaper has devoted hundreds of thousands of words to attacking the Racial Discrimination Act, when there are regular beat-ups on race in the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph, when nocturnal panels on Sky News endlessly berate multicultural political correctness or indeed feature neo-Nazi criminal thugs, or when Pauline Hanson makes regular appearances on Sunrise and Today while you're chewing on your breakfast, or when we are seeing a resurgent race politics in our national debate going up to the most senior members of the government. From broadsheet to tabloid, from breakfast to nighttime TV, from backbenchers to the Prime Minister, there's plenty of race baiting happening right now. As for identity politics, who is it exactly that is practicing identity politics? Isn't it a form of identity politics when it's argued that the cause of repealing 18C is in the service of a mainstream Australia that's being stifled by ethnic and racial minorities? Or when the language of mainstream Australia or middle Australian values is used as a code for something racial? Doesn't it reflect a form of identity politics when people argue that cultural Marxism is undermining Western civilization? Let's be clear. Of course it does. And it reflects an identity politics that is aimed at securing the privileges of some and at keeping others in their place. We're talking about an identity politics that is about reinforcing a hierarchy of voice and power in Australia. Complaints about anti-racism stifling free speech are a resentment. It's about a resentment of minorities being able to speak up. They're the complaints, frankly, of snowflakes who can't hack it when people challenge racism in public. The views of the actual Australian mainstream on race and free speech are different. The vast majority of Australians recognise that the Racial Discrimination Act exists as an expression of our society's values and aspirations. The vast majority understand that one person's freedom shouldn't come at the expense of another person's freedom. The vast majority understand that free speech shouldn't be an excuse to vent racial hatred or hostility. So, when in March 2014, Fairfax Media Nielsen polled people about Section 18C, a whopping 88% said they believed it should remain unlawful to offend, insult, or humiliate people on the basis of race or ethnicity. And so, in March 2017, At the time that a bill about changing 18C was being debated in Parliament, another poll asking the same question found a resounding response of 78% agreeing the law should remain the same. Academic researchers found similar numbers. For all the clamour about changing 18C, there has consistently been an overwhelming majority of Australians who believe the Racial Discrimination Act should stay in its current form. And this is no minor detail. This is not a footnote. There are very few propositions in Australia that would be supported by about 80% of our society. But there are a number of propositions that are. A similar proportion of people support a non-discriminatory immigration policy. A similar proportion support multiculturalism. Not that you'd guess any of this from our public commentary on free speech, immigration, and multiculturalism. Clearly, the true middle ground of our society doesn't resemble much of our media and political debates. Those who object to the Racial Discrimination Act frequently call upon an image of an Australian mainstream that has limited tolerance for political correctness on race. Yet it is they and their version of identity politics that are out of step with contemporary Australia. Debates about the RDA and racism are unlikely to disappear. There's just too much ideological zeal, cultural anger, and racial resentment for the noise to die down. In recent months, for example, the Attorney General has flagged that he wishes for the office of Race Discrimination Commissioner to be renamed or redefined, that it should be called something like the Community Relations Commissioner or Racial Harmony Commissioner. Such a change can't happen through ministerial direction or through administrative tweaking. That's because the title and function of the Race Discrimination Commissioner are set by legislation. If anything's to change about the title of my office, it will require a change to the Racial Discrimination Act. I want to say this: there's simply no good reason for any kind of change. But we've got to be on guard. We are seeing challenges right now, both to diversity and to independent institutions in our public culture. Whether it's the concentration of media outlets or whether it's calls to privatise the ABC, Australian democracy is threatened by a reduction in the number of voices that can speak truth to power. On matters of race, it is clear that there are some who would prefer there not to be independent advocates for racial equality who are empowered to speak out without fear or favour. To those who may be entertaining yet another debate about racial discrimination, I say this: we have a Racial Discrimination Act for a simple reason. It's because our society rejects racism and rejects racial discrimination. And it's only right that the statutory officer under the Racial Discrimination Act is called the Race Discrimination Commissioner, as it has been since 1986. We've got little chance of fighting racism or racial discrimination if we can't even name racism or racial discrimination. You can't eliminate racism through positive thinking or through repetitions of the word harmony. If only we could. But if there is to be another move to change the Act, I know that fair-minded Australians and many communities are again ready to defend the Act, as they did in 2013 and 14, and as they did again in 2016 and 17. And as I reflect on the past 5 years, I can say that there's been no prouder achievement than to have stood alongside so many Australians in fighting off 2 attempts to change Section 18C. And standing together, we've sent a powerful message that the Australian community believes the RDA must be here to stay. I'm proud too of what we've achieved under the National Anti-Racism Strategy. We've had more than 400 organisations during the past 5 years involved as supporters of our Racism It Stops With Me campaign. and our public awareness videos last year received 1.6 million views on social media. We've conducted anti-racism work relating to employment, to schools, early childhood, local government, and sport. I'm proud as well of the conversation we've started about the representation of cultural diversity in Australian leadership through our Leading for Change research reports and the Leadership Council on Cultural Diversity that was established in 2016. But it's the work with our communities that has been most important to me. And I want to thank all those who strive with dedication and determination to make Australia a better place. I've seen it among the community leaders and advocates I've met across suburbs, in our capital cities, and those I've met in our regional towns and centres. From Bankstown to Bendigo, from Logan to Liverpool, Hobart to Hervey Bay in Queensland, I've seen it in action. I've seen it in communities like Bendigo, which came together in responding to nasty anti-Islam protests. I've seen it in places like Eltham, in Melbourne's northeast, where residents formed a group to help newly resettled Syrian and Iraqi refugees with learning English, with driving on Melbourne roads, and with finding jobs. It's not easy driving on Melbourne roads, you know. I've seen the power of anti-racism too, among citizens who have courageously stood up against hatred and bigotry, sometimes even putting their own safety on the line. I've seen it through communities that have fought back against systemic discrimination, like the one in Palm Island in Queensland. And I've seen it too in the young anti-racism advocates I've met who are coming together to build a better Australia. And I've seen it in people like Alpha Cheng, who lost his father Curtis Cheng to an act of terrorism here in Parramatta, but has become an advocate for inclusion and compassion, and has done so with a grace and strength which remind us of what it means to be moved by the better angels of our nature. We must always appeal to the better angels of our nature if we're to do better on race. The sobering reality is that many in our society struggle with even talking about racism. The real political correctness on this doesn't come from the Racial Discrimination Act. It comes from a parochial fragility. It's a fragility that explains why when racism is called out, the real offence in some people's eyes is not that an act of discrimination occurred, but rather that someone was subjected to being called racist. People should look at it another way. If you don't want to be called racist, start by not doing something that's racist. Sadly, social change can't ever be that simple. There are just too many ways for people to deny, dismiss, or deflect any challenge to us to do better. Perhaps most potently, people respond to racism in Australia by pointing out that racism is worse in other countries, as though that means we must stop talking about the issue here. This is a powerful way of saying that identifying racism amounts to an act of national disloyalty. It tarnishes anyone who raises racism as an ingrate who doesn't know the value of living in the best country on earth. Well, let me conclude on what it means to be anti-racist. To be anti-racist is a commitment that reflects the highest form of patriotism. It reflects the desire to see our country live up to its best. Now, there have been many times during the past 5 years when I've questioned my own sense of patriotism. There have been times when I've questioned whether our country has gone backwards on race because of the pandering to prejudice in public debates. But I can say this, my patriotism remains, and the first principles remain the same as well. We reject racism because it is an assault on our values and on our fellow citizens. We reject racism because it diminishes our nation. That is why we fight racism. It's because we think so highly of our nation in the first place. It's because we want to see our country do better. It's because we are committed to equality. And it's because we have a responsibility to uphold our values. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for your message about the importance of vigilance, about the dangers of race and politics that we're seeing today, about the importance of public debate and restoring standards in those debates, about the importance of bipartisan support for the Racial Discrimination Act, and also your message about the disconnect between media and politics and contemporary Australia. I hope we can all take some hope from that maybe we're not as bad as we seem to be, but also seek out new ways of making sure that those voices of moderation and tolerance and equality have a better way of being heard. So allow me now to introduce Mark and John, and I'll invite them then both to respond to what Tim has had to say this evening. The Honourable Mark Dreyfus, QC MP, is the Shadow Attorney General, Shadow Minister for National Security, and Deputy Manager of Opposition Business in the House. He has been the member for Isaac since 2007. As Attorney General, Mark has advocated for legal frameworks that support Australia's most vulnerable, built on values of fairness and equality of opportunity. These values are reflected in his experience working for and with Indigenous Australians and in his passion for the environment. Mark has been, of course, vocal in advocating for the establishment of a National Integrity Commission, with Labor committing to introduce one within 12 months of winning government. So we look forward to hearing from him first. And then we'll hear from Dr. John Hewson, AM. Dr. Hewson, as you know, was the leader of the Australian Liberal Party and Federal Coalition in opposition from 1990 to 1994. His political career included 7 years as a ministerial advisor and a further 8 years as the federal member for Wentworth in the federal parliament. He was Shadow Minister for Finance, Shadow Treasurer, and Shadow Minister for Industry and Commerce before becoming Leader of the Opposition. Dr. Hewson is an economist with experience in academia, business, government, media, and the financial system. He's worked for the Australian Treasury, the Reserve Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, and as an advisor to 2 successive federal treasurers and Prime Minister. Dr. Hewson is currently Professor and Chair in the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. So I'll invite Mark to come up first. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Leanne, for that kind introduction. Could I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge the many distinguished guests who are here to listen to what was an inspiring speech by Tim Soutphommasane in his theatrically named final speech as Race Discrimination Commissioner, and it was absolutely worth coming to hear. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to address you this evening, and in particular for the opportunity and privilege of thanking Dr. Tim Soutphommasane for his 5 years of excellent service to this country as our nation's Race Discrimination Commissioner. There can be no doubt how hard Tim has worked over the last 5 years, meeting challenge after challenge under conditions that at times could be described generously as difficult. As Tim mentioned this evening, it was on his watch that Tony Abbott came to power in this country with a promise to repeal Section 18C of the Race Discrimination Act. Fortunately, that promise from Tony Abbott was much like many of his other promises, and it came to nothing when the overwhelming public support for Section 18C forced the Abbott government to back down. And of course, the campaign to repeal Section 18C was hamstrung from the start, given that it was led with such comprehensive incompetence by Senator Brandis, who declared to the Senate that what all of this was about was the Liberal Party and its coalition partners trying to legislate a right to be bigots. And I won't even begin to remind you of the appallingly drafted amendments to Section 18C drafted by Senator Brandis himself. But it was more than just Brandisian incompetence that brought this first attempt to repeal Section 18C to an ignominious and welcome end. It was the fact that Tim, many others, but particularly Tim, spoke clearly and eloquently at event after event and in media interview after media interview about how Section 18C operated to protect Australia from the evils of racial hatred, and about how giving a green light to racist hate speech was going to harm rather than help our nation. And Tim also made very clear that those who said Section 18C was a threat to freedom of speech had conveniently forgotten to mention its sister provision, Section 18D, already contains extensive protections for freedom of speech. There is no doubt that Tim's measured explanations of what Section 18C has been used for and how it operated to set a standard in our nation opposed to racist hate speech helped to ensure that the Australian community rose up against the attempt by Abbott and Brandis to repeal those protections which would have given a green light to racist hate speech. We had thought that the complete failure of this attempt to repeal Section 18C would be the end of the matter, but it was always concerning that at no point did Mr Abbott or Mr Brandis concede that they may have been wrong in their attempt. And when Mr Turnbull disposed of Tony Abbott to take over as Prime Minister, we assumed that the matter of Section 18C was settled. So it was a great disappointment to so many who expected that Mr Turnbull would bring a different kind of leadership to the Liberal Party when Mr Turnbull himself revived the attack on Section 18C. Fortunately, with Senator Brandis at his side, this attempt to greenlight racist hate speech was again soundly defeated. But what both episodes say about the current state of Australian politics is deeply concerning. As many have observed, there has been a return to race as a political issue here in Australia and in many other countries around the world. I agree with what John Hewson said today, quoted in the media. John said this, and I quote, "Playing short-term politics with an issue that is so fundamental to our long-term national interest is damaging and dangerous." And I suspect those of you who've come looking for disagreement between John Hewson and I are going to be disappointed. While Australia is indeed one of the most successful multicultural nations on earth, that is in part because generations of Australians have worked hard to make that case the case. Until recently, the value of our multiculturalism was a bipartisan matter of pride, a great success that both Labor and Liberal governments proudly proclaimed their involvement in. Tim referred in his speech to a famous 1988 motion that the Hawke government put forward in the Parliament. And one of those that Tim mentioned without naming him, one of the Liberals who courageously crossed the floor to support that motion was Ian McPhee, who had been Immigration Minister under the Fraser government. And I was moved by what I saw Ian McPhee as being quoted as saying again in the media at the weekend, where there've been quite a few articles about this need for bipartisanship, partly prompted by speeches and articles that Tim's written. But this is what Ian McPhee had to say just now about those events in 1988. He said, and I quote, "When I was Minister for Immigration and Mick Young was the Labor spokesman, we became dear friends and travelled the whole of Australia with John Menadue," referring to the then Secretary of the Department of Immigration. And he went on, and I quote again, "to little towns and to cities, speaking at town hall meetings, explaining why we had a non-discriminatory policy. We worked so carefully together." And the article went on, "Howard's abandonment of this laboriously constructed bipartisanship and the continuing efforts of Conservative politicians to exploit issues of race for political ends have been," this is Ian McPhee again, and I quote, "quite tragic." And it does seem that things have been changing in recent times. Regrettably, we are seeing not just Conservative politicians playing the race card, but media outlets, and Tim mentioned this in his speech, giving a platform to racism. Just last night, Sky News gave a platform to Blair Cottrell, a far-right figure, infamous for wanting to hang a picture of Adolf Hitler in every Australian classroom. He was invited onto the 24-hour news channel as a guest of former Northern Territory Chief Minister Adam Giles for a one-on-one studio interview. And again, as Tim's already noted in his speech, last week we had a senior News Corp columnist, Andrew Bolt, writing in his column about what he called, quote, a tidal wave of immigrants. His piece included this memorable passage, and I quote, "In Melbourne's North Caulfield, 41% of residents are Jews, including hundreds who have lately fled South Africa. Dandenong now has an official Little Indian cultural project with 33 Indian businesses. Such colonising will increasingly be our future as we gain a critical mass of born overseas migrants." That's all I'm going to quote, you'll be pleased to hear. It's in this context that the claims of some on the conservative side of politics that we have no racism in Australia are particularly offensive. And I'd give as an example something from a recent budget estimates hearing at Parliament in May of this year. The chair of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the Senate, Senator Ian MacDonald, asked a minister, Senator Michaelia Cash, whether the government had, quote, considered whether there is a need in Australian society for a racism commissioner. And Senator MacDonald went on, and I quote, "I might live in a bubble, perhaps, but I find it very difficult to find any but very rare cases of racism in Australia." And he followed up with this line, "There are obviously isolated aspects of racism in Australia, but I would think across the board they're very isolated." In a recent article, Tim wrote thoughtfully about how in some ways the Australian myth of egalitarianism itself works against facing the problems of racism head-on. Tim wrote that powerful national myths of this kind, quote, allow for people to remain impervious to evidence or to live with cognitive dissonance. On matters of race, our mythical egalitarianism helps us to avoid having hard conversations. I would say that hard conversations are what we need to have. Now, it seems we need them more than we have needed them for a long time. The appointment of a successor to Tim will not be an easy task, but it is my hope that the Turnbull government will, despite some recent suggestions to the contrary, recognise the importance of the role of Race Discrimination Commissioner and appoint a person with that title. And I also hope that the Turnbull government is able to appoint someone who has the appropriate mix of courage, integrity and professionalism to carry on where Tim will very soon leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me begin by also paying my respects to the original owners on the land on which we're meeting, and in particular to the elders past, present and future. But as a personal view, I think it's about time we gave them proper recognition in our Constitution, and we elevated the challenge of closing the gap to the level it should be if we want to get rid of that black mark from a racial discriminatory point of view in this country. I'm a little awkward here tonight, not sure where I'm supposed to sit. As far as I sit on the panel, I've been put on the hard left. From your point of view, I've been put on the hard right. So I decided tonight not to speak as a Liberal, but to speak as an Australian. I was asked some time ago, what's the greatest achievement in Australia in the post-war period? And, you know, your mind goes to sporting achievements and stands we've taken in international forums and 27 consecutive years of economic growth or whatever. But to me, our greatest achievement is the fact that we've built a very tolerant, multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious society that in many respects is the leading example of a multicultural society in the world. And that is an enormous achievement, but is also still a work in progress. We still have a lot to do to make sure that we continue to build and develop that tolerant, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. And I think in many cases we have a long way to go. As was said, politics these days is very short term. It's very populist, it's very opportunistic. Unfortunately, it's mostly negative, mostly because I guess of my ex-press secretary who became Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who elevated negativity to an art form in politics. But it's that short-termism that's a real problem. It's that populism that's a problem. It's become so much easier for those who want to make a point about race or about multiculturalism to play the race card, to score points on a day-to-day basis to the benefit of their short-term political benefit as they see it, not necessarily from a national point of view, but at enormous cost to us as a nation, to our standing internationally and domestically, and I think in terms of our attitude to ourselves. It is a work in progress that needs to be built on. It needs to be nurtured, and we all have a collective responsibility in making sure that that happens. In my own experience, I guess race, my attitudes to race have developed over many years. In the 1950s, I lived very close to the Herne Bay migrant settlement. It was so much of concern to the local residents of that community that they ultimately changed the name to Riverwood rather than continue to be associated with a migrant settlement. When I was a graduate student in the United States, I went to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. In 1969, within a year of about 80% of Baltimore being burnt to the ground by the black riots of the time. And in fact, our so-called, as it was then, student ghetto bordered on the black ghetto, and we had a cyclone fence between us. It was a very instructive and informative period for somebody like me, growing up in the sort of background that I'd had in this country, to understand the issue of race. And as I started to jog with some black Americans and learn some of the trials and tribulations of their life, I started to understand the magnitude of that challenge. In the Fraser government, though, I came as an advisor to the Treasurer and the Prime Minister at a time where multiculturalism was building. His development of multiculturalism was building on the Racial Discrimination Act of the Whitlam Government. It's a very significant period, and when you think back, the resettlement of the Vietnamese boat people in that period was a very significant development. Malcolm subsequently said that, of course, he never bothered to take that issue to Cabinet or to actually draw any particular public attention to what he was doing, and doubted that if he had, he would ever have been able to achieve what he achieved. Which is, I think, an interesting comment at the time, but it shows what can be done with effective leadership at the political level. And they were very informative experiences for me. Of course, when Hewson came along, I was, as a Liberal, concerned about the fact that she was able to make that maiden speech, and it took John Howard 3 or 4 days to respond. And when he finally did, he said, we have to realise that there are people in this community, in the Australian society, that actually hold these sort of views. He missed a unique opportunity to out what was blatantly based racial discrimination, in my view. And I had a bit of an altercation with a senior member of the party at the time, saying how disappointed I was that this process had run its course. And I was told I didn't understand, because this would bring a flood of votes to the Liberal government, Liberal National Government. I said, no, in my view, if it actually takes hold in Australia, she'll probably form a party and take votes off you. And while I was right, I'm very embarrassed by that entire experience. Today, I've had various roles with the Italian community, the Croatian community in business and in society, the Chinese community, and currently with the Islamic community. And I get offended every time I turn around and I see the issue of immigration or the issue of 18C being nudge, nudge, wink, wink. This is an opportunity for racist sentiment to be exploited in this country. I have this concern that there is a latent level of racism in this country. When you scratch the surface in some sections of our community, it doesn't take too much for those racist sentiments to be expressed. And that is a problem when I think the overwhelming majority of the Australian community, as Tim has said in terms of his numbers and the survey numbers, are very strongly of the view that it is probably our greatest achievement, this multicultural, multiracial society, and it needs to be developed and nurtured very carefully. I would close by simply saying, look, if you see any evidence of racism in any way, at any level in this society, you've got to out it. You have to call it out for what it is and stand up against it. And as Tim said, part of that response is leadership, not just political leadership, and we'd like to see a fair bit of that at the national and state level these days, where they too have often exploited these issues for the sake of short-term political benefit. But it's leadership of all levels of our society, and each individual in their day-to-day lives has a clear responsibility, I think, to out racism when they see it, to recognise the cost, the long-term cost to our standing as a nation if they don't. A fundamental part of that is, of course, bipartisan support. And I get very concerned when I see that starting to fray at the edges, because bipartisanship has been fundamentally important to the development of the anti-discrimination legislation in this country and the positions that various governments have ended up taking. And I'd hate to see that lost as an Australian. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and John, for those thoughtful comments and insights. So we have about half an hour now, and we'd really love to hear from you, your response to Tim's speech or your thoughts on this particular issue. I'm sure there's no need to remind everyone that this needs to be a respectful conversation, so thank you for making your comments or your questions in that tone. My colleague Mark has a microphone and will be roving around to take your questions as you ask them. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself briefly and letting us know who your question is directed to. And I'll take about 3 questions at a time so that we can then turn to the panel for a response. So who would like to start us off this evening? I see a hand up here.
My name's Richard, and it's to the panel, but do you think the next Commissioner will be a puppet, given the government's attitude to the Racial Discrimination Act?
Thank you. Another question? Comment? Well, why don't we take that one first while you're thinking up your questions and comments in the audience? Who'd like to start?
Well, I hope that the next Commissioner will be a fierce advocate and will take seriously their independent role as a statutory officer. Commissioners like me, or like my colleagues Kate Jenkins and Alistair McEwen, we're not employees of the Australian Public Service. We don't take direction from ministers or from the government. That's not our job. Our job is to uphold the spirit of the laws under which we're appointed and to promulgate the principles associated with human rights and anti-discrimination in our area. So whoever the next person is, I wish them well. I'll be there to support them as a private citizen, but I hope that they'll be able to do their job independently, without fear or favour, and I hope that they won't ever hesitate to disagree with a government or with a government position if it is detrimental to our racial harmony, because the Australian community should rightly expect anyone in a role such as this to act independently and to do what's right.
Yeah, I'd agree with Tim, because, and I'd perhaps stress, and I hope not being overly optimistic, these are statutory roles. The Race Discrimination Commissioner is a statutory role. There's an independence to the role, and the history of people who have occupied these positions, the presidents and the 7 commissioner positions, as there presently are, have all shown, and obviously different commissioners have performed their roles in different ways, and different presidents have performed their role as presidents of the Human Rights Commission in different ways, but all of them have been independent. I think it's pretty difficult to conceive that you could occupy one of these positions and just be a puppet. That's not the way in which Australians occupy these positions, and I don't think too many people would seek this position if that was in fact their intention or they had a preparedness to be a puppet. I think the role, to some extent, and the statute under which the role is occupied dictates the way in which the role is going to be performed.
I agree completely. Statutory independence is fundamentally important. There's a bit of a tendency in terms of short-term politics to try and undermine that from time to time in various statutory appointments. I think this is one where you certainly can't afford for that to happen. And if this role is to have any substance at all, as Tim has shown, that independence is fundamentally important.
I see a hand up just in the middle here, and then another one here, Mark.
Thanks, panel. What is it? What do you so sure that it will remain the same? You only have to look at what they did to Gillian Triggs, right? They run her out of job. They want to give her another job. They disagree with her report, the children, whoever, in Manus. And also, Tim, why did they appoint Tim Wilson? Just to challenge your work. So if they can do that, why can't they do it likewise, or even worse now that, given that the politics are more toxic?
Thank you for the question. And just over here, Mark.
My name's Michael. Thank you very much tonight, Tim, for your speech. You raise a lot of points about how multicultural society and multicultural policy has been threatened by often right-wing and reactionary comments, particularly during your tenure as Race Commissioner. In the interest of moving forward and finding solutions, I'm wondering how a robust refugee policy could come back and complement a resurgent multicultural policy to combat the sentiment of which you mentioned tonight.
Thank you for the question. We'll take one more over here and then go to the panel.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech. I'm working here in Western Sydney, and I would like to know, how do you tackle the microaggressions, like the racist microaggressions that all migrants endure on our daily life? For example, when people say, oh, your English is very good, right? And you have a PhD from an Australian university, but they couldn't believe it because you have an accent. So they cannot picture a person with an accent that is Australian and has an Australian passport and an Australian PhD, that, you know, because they have an accent, they still doubt about their capacity.
To the panel.
Well, I'll have a shot at all the questions. To the first question about how we can be sure about anything that's going to happen, well, simply you can't be sure about what's going to happen. And that's all the more reason for us to be vigilant, and that's all the more reason for citizens who care about these issues to speak up and consider speaking up now, because people can shape decisions and can influence what governments do. Sometimes silence can be taken as acquiescence or acceptance. And if there is no concern expressed, for example, about the weakening of our institutional stance about racial discrimination, then we should not be surprised if we are to see any attempts to weaken our institutional stance about discrimination. Now, I know that there's a lot of fatigue out there in the many communities that have to contend with racism and discrimination, but they've got to be vigilant right now. Everyone's got to be vigilant right now. All the more so given we have seen the march of some extremist forces and the emboldening of far-right politics. And I think the next battle on racial discrimination may not be a full frontal assault on the Racial Discrimination Act. There have been 2 attempts of a full frontal assault, and they've been crushed. That's why the next attempt might come in a more subtle way. There might be a Trojan horse in the form of a change to the name of the Race Discrimination Commissioner. Because once a bill is introduced to Parliament, and once it's debated on the floor, anyone can move an amendment. And that's when you're likely to see the 18C debate open up again. So we should be very, very careful about entertaining any kind of change to any part
of the legislation because we know that there is a group of people in our political and media classes who would love to have another crack at the RDA. So you can't be sure. That's why you've got to protect it and really stand guard right now. On to the second question about refugees. Our immigration policy must have a humanitarian component to it. I think it's central to the soul of our country that we take in people who are fleeing persecution and are fleeing from conflict. This is about who we are as a country, and I think too often we get into the territory of punishing people who might be seeking refuge based on how they get here or how they try to get here, because they don't succeed in getting here in the first place in many instances. We need to have a more humane debate about this, and if we're perfectly frank about it, you know, there is an element of race involved in this as well. The effects of our refugee policy have a disproportionate effect on those from certain parts of the world. And racial discrimination is something that exists not only in intention, but also exists in effect. If something has the effect of discriminating on the basis of race, that can count as a form of discrimination as well. So I think we can do better on that issue. The third question about microaggressions, and I took the question, I gather, I think you said, well, how do we counter that, the microaggressions that you might experience? I think it takes every conversation to push back. You know, I still have conversations sometimes where people will compliment me on how good my English is. To which I say, well, I've spoken it since I was 3 years old, so hopefully it's okay. And I think this is an illustration, by the way, at a more immediate level of what I was just saying with respect to the previous question about intent and impact. We often think of racism only about intent. This idea that you've got to be a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan before you could ever be called a racist. But you don't need to be a card-carrying member of an extremist organisation and do something that discriminates. It's the effect, it's the impact that counts as much as the intent. And this is so true when we look at what you refer to as microaggressions or the daily conversations that people have where people can get belittled or get demeaned. And I think it's important too for those who don't experience racism to understand the kind of damage this does. The fact that it just chips away at you. It doesn't destroy you in one stroke. But if this happens every day and people are putting you down every day, you can start questioning yourself. But no one should ever think of themselves as being second class or not being as good as others. That would be a recipe for mediocrity, and I don't think we want to have a society that's mediocre. So I would hope that those who experience microaggressions find ways to speak back, usually with wit and humour, if possible. And I hope that those who don't experience microaggressions can develop greater literacy on race so that they can understand what's happening around them.
Well, I'll have a go at the three questions too. On the challenges, where you asked in your question or mentioned in your question the constant attacks on Gillian Triggs or concerns that were raised about the appointment of Tim Wilson as Human Rights Commissioner. Tim, of course, has been Race Discrimination Commissioner during that same period, and I actually take heart, despite the fact that this has been a very difficult government to work under for all of the commissioners at the Human Rights Commission and the two presidents, the way in which the Human Rights Commission and all of the commissioners have stood up to those attacks is something that people ought to take heart from. That the structure is a good one, could always be improved, but Australians have fought to maintain and resist, to maintain the structure, to resist attempts to weaken the Race Discrimination Act, to resist attempts at other weakenings. And I'd have to say this also about Tim Wilson, who now sits with me in the Parliament. For all that I might not have agreed in some of the views that he expressed, say about free speech or about his particular role as Human Rights Commissioner. At no point, and Tim can confirm this, did Tim Wilson, as the Human Rights Commissioner, ever attack any of his fellow commissioners, and publicly at least worked as part of the team at the Human Rights Commission, even though it might have been thought that he brought particular agendas to that role. One of the reasons why that was the outcome of what might have been feared as an appointment of someone like Tim Wilson from the IPA as Human Rights Commissioner was because of the legislative structure under which he was working, because of the duties that he was required to perform and the instructions that every one of the commissioners gets from their legislation. I don't have time to talk about refugee policy at any length, and I'm not going to try. I would say, echoing Tim's comment, that we've got to resist any suggestion of introducing a discriminatory element in not just our refugee policy, but any immigration policy. We've got to maintain that direction, that absolutely clear position we have arrived at in this country of a non-discriminatory policy for people coming here. And I wouldn't presume to offer direct advice about how one might tackle daily microaggressions or discrimination. Perhaps I'd look at it from the other end and say that what the leadership of this country does and says matters in relation to the way in which all Australians behave towards each other. Because one of the things that's been striking to me over the last 4 years or so is that when we have had absurd and inflammatory statements made by our national leaders, I'd start with people have a right to be bigots, it has been taken as licence by very many other Australians to engage in what you've referred to as microaggressions or worse. And I see this as a national project which is a work in progress, and as a work in progress we all have to work at it. That's been one of the great and striking things about Tim's tenure as Race Discrimination Commissioner. He sees this as a work in progress. It is a work in progress, but we have been set back mightily recently by statements from some of our national leaders, and I, for one, am going to continue to call it out.
A couple of quick comments. On the first question, Tim expressed concern about a possible Trojan horse. You wouldn't want the replacement for Tim to be that Trojan horse. You wouldn't want somebody to be put there with the, nudge, nudge, wink, wink task of downplaying the significance of the role. And I'm very concerned that that may be a possibility in terms of the way that role is filled. In terms of refugee policy, well, it is a bit discriminatory in the sense that we are concerned about boat people, but we're not so concerned about those who fly in and overstay their visas and otherwise qualify for residency in this country. It goes to both sides. If you're going to have an offshore processing base to your refugee policy, the other shoe is you must have a resettlement strategy that works. And if you don't have that, you end up with the embarrassment, national embarrassment, I think national disgrace we've got of not being able to place, 1,500 people that are left on Nauru and Manus at the present time. And to put your hopes on Trump solving that problem, I think is a bit much. In terms of your position and, microaggression and so on, I think you're winning. Quite frankly, your performance is knocking it dead. You just have to keep going.
Thank you, John. I see that Jeff has a question, but I have to go to the back room because I think there have been a few people waiting back there. So I think Sandra's taking the microphone there first.
Thank you. Hi. Hello, my name is Rachel Jacobs, and Tim, thank you very much for an inspiring address, and that follows an inspiring term as well. My question is about values, and my parents taught me the values that were hard work and the value of education and lifelong education. Tenacity, they taught me bravery, having moved from one place and left everything they had, to another. And you'll just have to believe me, because you can't see me from here, that those values came from another country, specifically from India. And my parents did not have a university education or have higher education, but those values resulted in a very fortunate chain of events that led to me working here at Western Sydney University. I'm a lecturer in the School of Education. My questions about the term Australian values is that every time we use that term, do we pretend that we somehow have a monopoly on values, that our values are better than anyone else's, therefore Australians, whoever they are better than anyone else, are better than anyone else, and that's usually white Australian values is what we're referring to. Would it be better for us to talk about human values, the things that bring us together, things that bind us, the things that make us a better society, the things that make us a better human race? Would that be a better term for us rather than continuing down a path of beating Australian values and thereby beating up anybody who we think didn't come in the right channel or didn't wait their turn, or demonising and criminalising refugees who have taken a path because they have valued their lives? Aren't everyone's values, don't they all have some kind of credit?
Thank you for that question. We'll take another one from Jeff in the front here, Mark, in the second row.
Jeff Gallop, I'm a fully recovered political addict, I think. I'd like the panel to discuss one aspect of this issue. And thank you very much, Tim, for your tour de force through all of the issues you faced and how you articulated the case for a non-discrimination policy and a multicultural society. I think was very good. I'd like all of you to think and talk about one aspect of it. And I'll preface my comments by going to Trump's America and a meeting that was recently held, or a couple of years ago, of the Centers for Disease Control, an extremely important statutory authority in the United States that exists to research public health issues. And they recently had a meeting in Atlanta, and representatives of the White House Budget Office were there and said, if you're going to make submissions for money, there are 7 words you shouldn't use: entitlement, vulnerable, transgender, fetus, science-based policy, and evidence-based policy. But there was one other word they used, and I'd like the panel to talk about this: diversity. Apparently it's a bad word. When you think about what's been successful about multicultural societies that take the policy aspects of it seriously, is this diversity thing. And we're in a university, and universities have been very good at taking on board people from all parts of the world and bringing diversity to the Australia, new ideas, new connections. People who come from other parts of the world bring all sorts of interesting things to our country, and it adds value. And when you look at the successful societies through human history, the one that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, because I spent 9 months living there, was the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic of the 17th century actually invited people from other parts of the world to come to their nation, particularly Jewish people from around Europe, and they created the most progressive and exciting nation in the world at that time. And so perhaps I'll start with John might start, diversity and economics, because clearly we're now seeing that there is an anti-immigration argument that's developing, which we're told isn't a racist argument, but is about economics, that it's better for Australia not to have migrants because we can manage our affairs better and we can have more economic growth because other people are pinching our jobs or they're coming here, etc., putting demand on our infrastructure. I think one of the other important aspects of multiculturalism is its job-creating capacity, if I can put it as crudely as that. I think Tim's right, you defend it on human rights, but when you defend human rights, the funny thing is all sorts of other things happen too, one of which is you get a better society and a stronger economy. And I just, particularly John, given his background as an economist, could perhaps talk about the role that, that is played in creating jobs from active multiculturalism.
Thank you, Jeff. So to the panel, you have one more question before we go to the panel, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Jack, and thank you. I'm from the Netherlands, so thank you for... if I may, Tim, thank you very much for your very inspiring speech. It was worthwhile coming here all the way from Hornsby. That leads me to the question, the Philip Broddock review. I think it's sort of related. It's been delayed. I think people have been waiting for 2 months now. My question is, do you think it's just a lead balloon that sort of was put in place there by Malcolm Turnbull to sort of pacify or, you know, give something the Australian to write about? Or is it something you will think is going to have an effect? It's going to be important to be discussed. And can I also make a point? The guy, Blair Cottrell, he was also interviewed on an ABC program 2 years ago on Hack Live. So, yeah, thank you.
All right, to the panel, 3 very big questions. Who'd like to start?
I feel the onus to get things going. To Rachel, thank you for your question. And I understand where you're coming from in expressing concern about how Australian values can be used to exclude or to offer a way of expressing a form of chauvinism. But I think it's very dangerous for us to surrender national identity to those who want a narrower conception of our community. When I think of what happens when you surrender national symbols and national belonging to extremist groups, I think of what happened in Cronulla here in Sydney in 2005. That's an extreme example of where you can end up if you do not occupy a centre which acknowledges that for many people a national identity is important and remains relevant. Now that's not to take anything away from the experience of others who may have a more cosmopolitan or global outlook to life. But I think there's a real risk of closing off conversations with people if you are suggesting that a national identity or tradition has no meaning anymore. Clearly these things still have purchase. Our life still is dictated to some degree by national rhythms and by national conversations. We don't have a global parliament, for example, which sets laws for us, which have binding force or which shape our everyday interactions. It's the federal parliament that's going to have more impact on how we experience life here. So for me, if we're going to talk about Australian values, I think they are meaningful. That's not to say that the kinds of things I would list as Australian values are exclusive or owned only by Australia and Australians. When I say, for example, that we should value something like equality or fairness and defend those values, I'm not for a moment suggesting that only Australians believe in equality and fairness, but Australians experience those values and have a certain inflection on those values which is very different to what they mean in other places. I mean, you think about how in Australia so many people would hop into the front seat of a taxi. Now you might think this is a trivial example, but there are many other countries where if you hop in the front seat of the taxi driver is going to think you're going to try and mug him. Or you think of the fact that here in Australia, everyone's going to refer to everyone else by their first name. That's not common in many other countries. I mean, in France, for example, where I was born, sometimes you had to wait a number of decades before you could move from the formal address to the informal address. In America, for example, at a university, it would be unheard of to refer to your professor by their first name. But these are, in my view, expressions of how we value something like equality in Australia. I think they're expressions of how we wouldn't tolerate certain social hierarchies and how we're more relaxed and informal. The idea that Jack is as good as his master, if not better. So for me, these are all indications that a national identity still has purchase, but I think it's got to be a generous kind of national identity, and that's going to overlap with many of the human values that you speak of as well. To Jeff and diversity, I mean, on the economics of diversity and and our success as a multicultural society, I have no doubt whatsoever that with the shift to skilled migration in the late 1970s in our migration program, we had the foundations of our multicultural success to some extent, which is to say that in having a very selective program of immigration for the last few decades, Australia has taken a path which has meant that it has already inbuilt to some degree the success of integration. Because if you're coming here and you're well educated, you can speak English, you're not going to need as much support in finding a job or in settling in. So I think that's one of the key parts of the success of our migration program. But going to your broader point about diversity, it's clear that at the moment you have a bit of a backlash against diversity. And this is a reminder that you can't take for granted gains in any arena of social progress or reform. So once you make the case for something, that doesn't mean that you can walk away and think it's mission accomplished. You've got to prosecute the case again and again and again and again. And every time you stop for a moment, or you hesitate, or you get complacent, you can be sure that there will be some chipping away at what you've achieved. And here I believe that there needs to be a concerted effort in Australia, not only in public debate, but also within organisations, to make clear what we gain from our diversity. And if you think of the diversity that we're not harnessing at the moment, I mean, look at all of our institutions, whether it's in business or politics or government or indeed universities, you don't see anything remotely like our cultural diversity yet being represented, particularly in senior leadership of our organisations and institutions. And there I think of what we're losing and what we stand to lose if we don't get this right. So I would hope that the debates we're having at the moment don't suffocate diversity or detract people from entering our institutions. I mean, you think of the debate about Chinese foreign influence in Australia, and I shudder to think of the effects it's going to have on the 1.2 million Australians who have Chinese heritage. How likely is it going to be in the next 5 or 10 years that we'll see Australians of Chinese background put their hands up to run for Parliament or to enter the Australian public service? I mean, why would you if you think you're going to be smeared as a foreign agent of influence? You know, you might be asking yourself, well, I could enter the public service, but am I going to hit a ceiling if I don't get security clearance because I've got family in China, or because I once had Chinese citizenship and I've naturalised as Australian? Or you think of the decisions that political parties are going to make and how they're going to pre-select candidates. What happens if you have an outstanding candidate who has a Chinese background and the party apparatus thinks, ooh, great candidate, but do we really want to run a candidate who's going to be open to a fifth column attack from our opponents? I mean, these are the sorts of questions that many Chinese Australians are asking already because of the debate we're having, and I fear for the consequences that it will have in the future decade that we're about to go into. As for Jack, I don't know what the Ruddock review has said. The government hasn't released that yet. I've not seen a copy of it, but I find it interesting that Attorney General Christian Porter has said in one interview earlier this year that he believes a possible change to the title of Race Discrimination Commissioner is an interesting question to ponder, given we are talking about religious discrimination issues as well. I find that an intriguing proposition. What that means, I don't quite know. But it suggests to us that we've got to be absolutely vigilant, again, of any Trojan horses. And you're right too that Blair Cottrell did enjoy a platform through Hacken and ABC TV. I was uncomfortable with what happened there. I think if there's a difference between what happened with Sky News and with that was a panel where there were 4 or 5 others, and I think he was rightly subjected to a lot of scrutiny and hostile questioning in that panel, whereas what we saw last night on Sky was Adam Giles sitting one-on-one with Blair Cottrell in a suit, elevated as a commentator, and that is deeply troubling.
Mark, John?
You go first. Stay with the order.
I'm offering to defer to John here, but first on Rachel's question about whether or not it's better to say human values than Australian values. I'm a proud Australian. I'm a proud member of the Australian Parliament, and in that role, I accept that there's a contest about what Australian values are, but I'm not about to give up the ground to what I see as the other side of that contest, and I agree with Tim on this, by accepting that they get to talk about Australian values and I don't. I have as much right as any other Australian, as any person living in Australia, and everyone in this room has an equal right to engage in that discussion about what are Australian values. And we start from the position that it is contested ground. I happen to think, non-exhaustively, that Australian values include a respect for our democracy and a celebration of the democracy that we've had here in parliamentary form for nearly 120 years at the national level and longer, although we didn't have complete franchise if you go back into the colonies. I happen to think that there's an Australian value that is about the fair go. I happen to think there's an Australian value that is about acceptance, this really goes to Jeff's question, of difference, acceptance of diversity. There are other people in Australia who clearly don't agree with that last value that I've just articulated, and I could go on. There's a whole range of other values which I see as Australian values, which very often are also human values, but there's a debate, and it's an ongoing debate here in this country now, and regrettably there's been some pretty ugly things said on the other, what I regard as the other side of this debate recently. It's a shocking thing to think that anyone could have seriously suggested to a US government agency that the word diversity or anyone applying to that agency ought the word diversity ought not be used. I don't think we'll ever get to that in this country, because I think that a very substantial majority of Australians like the diverse society that we have become, accept the diverse society that we've become, and understand how much value all of us, the whole community, gets from that diversity. There's a recognition in this country that diversity gives us strength. It's what underlies anti-discrimination law, to return to the subject of tonight, a recognition that being diverse in some way in no sense is a disadvantage, and suggesting that it does would weaken all of us. So I don't think we're going to get to that in this country, Jeff. I hope we never do. I think we're a long way off it. The statistics that Tim gave in his talk about the level of support for 18C, I think, are reflective of a very substantial majority of the Australian community that understands just how much to be treasured is the accepting, diverse society that we've actually become in not that long, 40, 50 years ago, we had a White Australia policy in this country. Now we don't. Now we have more than half of all of our community either born overseas or one parent born overseas. That gives you an idea of the diversity that we see in our community. I represent an electorate where there are people from over 180 countries. And it is an extraordinarily harmonious community at the same time as being an extraordinarily diverse community. And there's not actually that many countries in the world where you can go to that you can say that about their community. And on the Ruddock Review, we're all waiting with bated breath, Jack, to see what it says. It came out of, its genesis, of course, was a sop to the hard right of the Liberal Party at the height of the debate about marriage equality in this country. Who knows what it's actually going to produce? Because at the time it was born, it was to deal with the protection of bakers who didn't want to bake a cake for gay couples at their wedding, and that sort of issue. Of course, it's not possible to commission a review by a former Commonwealth Attorney General and 4 other eminent Australians and expect that it's going to be narrowed to those issues raised by the marriage equality debate. of course, the report will have to deal with wider questions. It's going to have to deal with how you could possibly think to look at religious freedom other than in some wider framework where all other rights and freedoms are also being looked at. So we're all waiting to see what the report says, and equally waiting to see what the government's response to that report is going to be, if indeed either is going to be forthcoming, because the Ruddock panel handed their report to the government on the 18th of May. We're still waiting.
On values, I'm concerned that this is just yet another way to play the race card in this country. Well, it's not. Well, we do from time to time perhaps need to think about these sort of issues. Always worry who's defining the values, and what emphasis they're trying to put in the arguments about those values. And from what I've seen in recent days, it's just another way of raising this issue in a way, in the context of now an emerging debate about immigration. Sure, we want to have immigrants, but they have to sign up to our values. We've had various attempts at specifying what these values are or what a citizen of Australia should be able to do. I mean, Don Bradman's batting average was Howard's main contribution to that debate. This becomes ridiculous when it gets reduced to some of those interpretations of what that debate's about. And I worry that if we as a nation are so insecure that we don't know what those values are, we really do have a bigger issue than is being recognised. On diversity, I mean, diversity has been, I think, probably hard, Jeff, for people to accept and get used to. One of the most obvious manifestations of diversity is all the food, all the range of foods. I remember as a child, the first Chinese restaurant opened in our suburb. And the initial reaction, everyone was, oh, the cats are disappearing. They're all hanging, and this was part of an immediate reaction to the idea of diversity. Today, you've got so many, such diverse options in terms of food and so on that, it's just an extreme, taking a particular aspect of that. But I think it's been hard for some people to accept that people are different and that there is value in being different. And that adds to the richness of our society. In terms of the economics of it, there's overwhelming evidence of the benefits of immigration. This whole nation has been built on immigration. And more recently, of course, the focus on skills immigration and business immigration and so on have brought a particular uplift to national productivity and national well-being. It hasn't been without its problems. As I said in my remarks, it has to be managed. I mean, we are developing the richness of a multicultural society. It comes with a lot of pressures. There are things that people don't like in that process. And there's always that element that, I do a bit with the Islamic community these days and looking at the development of a Sharia-compliant financial institution, a bank. And I warned them at the start that you've got to understand that in terms of the average Australian, that might be an issue. In the sense that when Jackie Lambie was asked, what's Sharia law? She said, terrorism. And a lot of people said, hey, tick that box. And, so it becomes a ridiculous element of the debate that you are compromising the benefits of diversity by ill-informed, ignorant comments like that and many others. But I do think over time the diversity of our development has just been fundamentally important, not just in terms of numbers of people, but in terms of the richness they've brought, not only in economic terms, but I would say in cultural terms. And our values have been broadened in that process quite significantly, and thank heaven they have, in a way, because some of the narrow Anglo-Saxon Protestants that I grew up with worry me. I went back to my old school the other day. They had a centenary development, and I could say that in Colton Primary, when I was there, it would be 99.9% white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, not even Catholic, but Protestant. Today you have the richness of diversity, the greatest mix of races, nationalities and ethnic backgrounds you can ever imagine. And the quality of that school has actually gone up dramatically, I would say, as a result of simply that.
Thank you, John. I'm looking at your watches upside down, and I think we are past 8:30. Am I right? So I sense some people are nervous to get going, but I know that there are some more questions. I think I'd like to propose that those who want to stay after the panel and have a drink or something else to eat can have those conversations or ask those questions of the panel. We might close up now because I know it's getting late on a Monday night and we've used up most of your dinner time. So on behalf of the Institute, let me thank you, Tim, for your really powerful and timely speech tonight. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you a little bit and to work with you for a brief period in your role as Commissioner. I was reading your book again, I'm Not Racist, but the other day, and I know that you noted in that book, and I quote, "Too often we end up with a perverse debate where sometimes calling out racism is regarded as a bigger moral crime than the perpetration of racism itself." And you've said as much tonight as well. And we just want to thank you. I think everyone in the room would like to thank you for never shying away from your responsibilities as Commissioner. So thank you very much. A huge thank you too to Mark and John for such forthright and sometimes entertaining contributions to the discussion. I learnt a lot about both of you and it was really valuable to have you here. Thanks to all of you who got involved in the conversation to ask your questions and make your comments, and to everyone for coming out to the Institute on a Monday night after a pretty blustery day and I'm sure a very long day for everyone. So we really appreciate you making the trek. A final thank you then to the staff of the Institute, our colleagues from Western Sydney University and from the Human Rights Commission, and also to our Auslan interpreters for such a great job they've done tonight, for making this evening possible. So if you have the energy, please do stay and enjoy another sandwich or something to drink with us, but otherwise, thanks again and we hope to see you soon.